Max Verstappen victorious in Qatar as the lights shine once again on the FIA stewards as Lando Norris receives a huge penalty, which means the constructors' title will be decided in Abu Dhabi. Elsewhere, Lewis Hamilton received not one, but two penalties, and Esteban Ocon, what appears to be his final race for Alpine, ended, well, just after a handful of seconds. From Racing News 365, my name is Nick Golding, and I'm delighted to be joined, as always, by lead editor Ian Parks. Ian, we've used the word bizarre about 100 times this weekend, and I feel like we're going to use it another 100 times just in this video.
We're going to go for chaotic. We're going for chaotic today, Nick. Today's buzzword is chaotic.
Chaotic. Okay, bizarre, because I'm. Where do we start? I mean, there is a lot of chaos to discuss, a lot of controversy to discuss regarding, again, the FIA. So let's start with something simple. Max Verstappen winning pretty comfortably in the end from second on the grid. Of course, had this bizarre one-place grid penalty, which we will refer to in a little bit. But of course, overtook George Russell at the first corner, had a few tussles with Lando Norris during the race, but ultimately, because Lando received a heavy penalty, which we will also discuss later on, in the end for Max, it'd be a long video. In the end for Max, despite dealing with a weird issue with the safety car lights, it was a pretty comfortable and crushing display once again by the four-time world champion.
Yeah, I said to somebody, a colleague of mine in the driver's pen post-race, that was about as comfortable a turn one sort of flag victory as you're ever likely to see. And Max would probably be, unbeknownst as to all the chaos that was going on behind him throughout the entirety of that Grand Prix, because literally, and yes, we are going to use the word chaos an awful lot, folks. So I do make my apologies in advance, but literally it was like, what on earth is going on? There was so much in that race that literally I think Nick and I could stand here, or I could stand here and talk to Nick for about the next 45 minutes, and we probably wouldn't get through everything. So we are going to have to try and précis a lot of it, but yes, great performance from Max, the mark of a four-time world champion. He did what he needed to do off the line, and I'm going to draw on that a little bit and allude to a little bit towards our headline, because Christian Horner, the Red Bull team principal, said afterwards that Max was annoyed. Well, Max was a little bit more than annoyed with George as to what had happened the previous night, post-qualifying or during qualifying, and obviously the verdict that came out post-qualifying. So going to get onto that in a couple of minutes. But yes, with regard to Max's performance, as I say, just the mark of a four-time world champion. It was comfortable, it was controlled. He stayed away from, as I say, all the mayhem that was occurring behind him. And he just put the cherry on top, basically, of that four-time world champion's cake. So again, hats off to Max. But let's move on to the real nitty-gritty stuff now, Nick, shall we?
The real nitty-gritty. Let's start with the first one regarding the safety car lights, because you mentioned their chaos, and we had not one, not two, but three safety cars. And of course, it was a bit weird because actually the only scare Max really had was during one of the safety car restarts, where it appeared that the safety car lights, as mentioned by a lot of the drivers, just simply did not go out.
It was, as you say, very weird. And I can imagine that would have been bizarre. Look, we've used that one too much now. Let's move on. And I can imagine as well, you can understand the confusion that resulted from that. A lot of the drivers would have been thinking, what are we supposed to do here? Right? And particularly Max, given the lead driver, as to, what was supposed to happen. But once again, he was able to manage that to the best of his ability at the time, given the circumstances. So he just got around it. It's what Max does. He just gets on with the job. He sees what's in front and judges, assesses. That's the type of driver that Max is. Again, as I say, it was just the hallmark of who he is at the moment, which is a four-time world champion.
Right, let's get into the really debatable stuff then involving Max and George Russell, because as you mentioned there, Max was pretty annoyed with his one-place grid penalty, which confused all of us, if I'm being completely honest. It was a new one, it felt, for Formula One, of course, involving George Russell, and it appears, based on comments from Max after the race, using the F-bomb a couple of times, effectively saying that George can F off, to put it simply, watching my language to make sure we don't do YouTube wrong in any way. But interestingly, Max kind of saying that he's lost all respect for George, that effectively saying that George is two-faced to a certain extent. And I mean, really powerful stuff. And I'll let you explain why Max has come out with such things, because it all does cement around what happened, not necessarily in that incident, but actually in the steward's room afterwards.
Yeah, just a very quick recap as to what had happened in that qualifying session. Max was penalised for driving unnecessarily slowly. It allowed a couple of cars to go faster. He was trying to open a gap. It got George Russell behind him, and George basically just head straight past Max going into a slight bend. And there was a near miss, we could say, and that basically led that. And because both were not on a push lap, just to clarify that, neither driver was on a push lap. The stewards deemed that Max was driving unnecessarily slowly, but because George behind wasn't on a push lap, it was worthy of a one-place penalty, something highly unusual, compared to what ordinarily might have been a three-place if George had been on that push lap. Now we get to the real nitty-gritty, and yes, we're using that phrase again, by the way, with regard to what unfolded. Max has basically turned around and said that what George says to camera is one thing, trying to be all nice and polite to the cameras. What he then turns around and says to the stewards is something completely different. And George was basically trying to get Max in as much trouble as possible. So you can imagine that it looked like what George was saying, he was advocating that three-place grid. However, credit to the stewards, if they looked at it a little bit differently, they saw the mitigating circumstances, they assessed that Max could see George in his mirrors. Conversely, of course, why didn't George, in seeing Max right in front of him and approaching at the rate of knots that he was, ease off, brake, whatever? But of course, George was obviously wanting to go for it because he was wanting then to get in his push lap straight afterwards. But as I say, Max fuming with George. As you say, he's pointed out, basically telling George to F off. Two-faced, you've used the phrase there, as to how George comes across, Mr. Nice Guy to the cameras, something completely different in the steward's room. So total respect lost from Max towards George. And folks, I'm just going to say this right now. I know, Nick knows, we all know at Racing News 365 what you guys are going to be writing in the comment section below. We are anticipating an awful lot of comments on this. We did get an awful lot of comments after the post-qualifying video, what to talk about, British bias, etc., etc. Please do try and keep it as clean as possible. We do implore you. So moving swiftly on, because I know we're going to come on to Lando now and the penalty he received, which surely might just smash that anti-British bias that some people like to discuss in our comment section.
Well, I think, we praise the stewards in a way for actually understanding the mitigating circumstances regarding the Max and George incident. And I mean, the Lando one, they've come under a bit of scrutiny, it's fair to say, because obviously Lando started in third, also made a good start and overtook Russell like Max at the first corner. Max and Lando had a couple of tussles during the race, but all fair, all clean, what we like to see. But crucially, and this is a massive incident because it doesn't just surround Lando's penalty. Lando, of course, received a mighty 10-second stop-go penalty. If I'm not mistaken, the second most severe penalty you can get in race, with obviously the most severe being a black flag. I mean, he received that for effectively failing to slow under double wave yellow flags, but obviously these are quite controversial circumstances because obviously the double wave yellow flag was down the start finish straight as a result of Kevin Magnussen's wing mirror having fallen onto the circuit in quite a dangerous position, I may add. And something Andrea Stella mentioned, and it's worth pointing out that Andrea looked at the data and said to media, yes, Lando did not slow down, and effectively agreeing that a penalty was the right decision. The issue here is the severity, because actually I saw a brilliant tweet actually explaining that Lando's penalty was the exact same as Lewis Hamilton received back at the 2021 British Grand Prix, obviously surrounding the incident with Max Verstappen there. Two very, very different incidents, and I think it's fair to say which one was more severe. But the issue with this one, Ian, is that The penalty, of course, dumped Lando to the back of the grid. He recovered to P10, got the fastest lap as well. It means that the Constructors' title does roll on to Abu Dhabi, with Charles Leclerc finishing second, Oscar Piastri in third. But the issue here is the wing mirror was on the circuit for several laps. For some laps, the yellow flags were out. For some laps, they weren't. It wasn't until Valtteri Bottas obliterated the wing mirror. It shattered across the circuit, causing Lewis Hamilton and Carlos Sainz to both sustain punches. We then got a safety car. And I mean, the whole thing feels like the FIA, a little bit, the stewards, kind of shot themselves in the foot, because all of it could have been avoided had they dealt with the loose wing mirror on the circuit as soon as it happened.
We're going to use 3 letters, VSC.
Yeah, or that.
That's all that was required to control that situation. It was pretty obvious it was there. We saw enough camera shots of that wing mirror sitting slap bang in the middle of the circuit, about 2/3 of the way down the start-finish straight. And you would have thought that someone with a bit of common sense in race control, hello, Mr. Rui Marquez, the new FIA race director, surely that's where you apply a VSC. The cars are going slow enough. You find a significant enough gap between those cars that are on track that would allow a marshal to go and retrieve that wing mirror safely. However, as you say, Nick, it sat there for lap after lap after lap. And ultimately, as was always going to be the case at some point, somebody drove over it. In this case, it was Valtteri Bottas. Shattered the wing mirror everywhere. Now, with that debris on track, did that then lend itself to the 2 punctures that were collected by Lewis Hamilton and Carlos Sainz? A little bit of debate around that, but suggestion was as well that on wearing rubber, and both drivers had gone for a very long stint on the opening set of new medium tires, that played its part as well, that the rubber was, as I say, wearing very thin at that point. And if they did collect any debris, then we saw, as I say, both those 2 punctures. However, getting back to the incident in point with regard to Lando Norris, as you say, he didn't slow sufficiently and the double waved yellow flags. He was caught in one sector and one sector only of the track, setting a personal best time. The suggestion is, and I don't know whether this is true or not, I have heard it, that it was Max Verstappen that effectively radioed through, believing that because Lando had pulled a bit too close, he believed that perhaps he'd set a quick sector time and therefore didn't respect the double wave yellows. The penalty, 10-second stop-go. You've drawn the perfect parallel, Nick, in all honesty, between what was occurring on track today and what occurred in that British Grand Prix in 2021. And we all know what took place there, where Lewis and Max went side by side. And of course, Max went spearing across the gravel. Huge G impact in the barriers, led to him going to hospital. An understandable 10-second stop go. Many people felt it should have been a more severe penalty for Lewis on that day. But of course, the letter of the law that the stewards applied that day, that was the strongest penalty that they could impose. So why today, when there was no significant danger on track at that particular time, was a 10-second stop go applied? Unfortunately for Lando, that pushed him right to the back of the pack. That heavily compromised his finishing position in the race. He did manage to get up into 10th position, managed to get a point for that, managed to get a point as well for the fastest lap he'd set earlier in the race. He'd salvaged 2 points. However, of course, that has now heavily compromised McLaren's position going into the final race of the season in Abu Dhabi next weekend with regard to the Constructors' Championship. As you pointed out, McLaren team principal Andrea Stella fully accepting of the penalty. They got the data. They could quite clearly see Lando was too quick in one of the sectors. Slam dunk, no problem, penalty. However, he believes that in this instance, it's a case of, and I'll use his pretty much paraphrasing a little bit, but very, very close to what he told us in the written media session after the Grand Prix, that it was a case of the stewards pretty much grabbing the rule book, giving it a good old dust down, opening it up, and it's like, oh, there it is, there's the rule. oh, that's the penalty. Let's go for that, without actually using that and thinking, do you know what? It's not really worth that. So we will go with what we think should be applied in this instance, as in a little bit of common sense. Because, between today or during the Grand Prix, whenever you might be watching this, and that British Grand Prix incident, two totally, completely separate severity of the incident. So Andrea Stella, very unhappy with the decision making behind, or the thought process
Yeah.
behind the penalty.
And of course, Toto Wolff, the Mercedes team principal, a really good point on that. He said that Lando's penalty was brutal. And of course, I think he knew what brutal felt like in the race because Lewis Hamilton received 2 penalties. We'll discuss that in a few moments. But actually, he pointed out that the penalty for Lando was brutal. But the issue that the stewards and the race director now have is that it's quite clear that a hard stance, it appears, is going to be taken, by Rui.
They've set a precedent. So basically, any incident like that is now going to be worth a 10-second stop go. And okay, if you want to apply the letter of the law like that every single time, go ahead and do that. At least then the drivers and the teams will know exactly where they stand. However, drawing upon that British Grand Prix parallel, surely there has to be that balance between that kind of severity of incident and the one that unfolded today, and where you apply within the regulations that degree of common sense. It's going to be a hard task now for the new race director, Rui Marquez, to look beyond what he's done today, because woe betide a similar incident like today and it doesn't get a 10-second stop go. That particular team, that particular driver is going to be up in arms, or or the other drivers and teams are going to be up in arms, was to say, well, hold on, you did that in the Qatar Grand Prix with Lando Norris. That driver there has gone and done it here. Where's the consistency? And that's long been the problem under the recent race directorship, not only today of Rui Marquez, but of course Neil Swittick as well. That there was that lack of consistency, and that's been one of the biggest bugbears of the drivers and the teams, that we've not seen that consistency. Well, here we go. Rui has, as I say, now set this real hard precedent, and it's got a lot to live up to in future races, that's for sure.
And of course, we've not even got to wait until next Sunday to see if the same happens, because actually, if something similar to what happened between Max and George happens in qualifying at the Yas Marina circuit, I mean, God, who knows what's going to happen. Of course, to those watching this video, of course, it's a very controversial topic, but let us know your thoughts on the Lando Norris penalty. Do you think it was a penalty? I think it was pretty slam dunk. But more importantly, if you think the severity was correct. And that's the big question here, and what we will also discuss in more detail in the podcast on Monday. Something else that Toto Wolff also mentioned is that, this penalty could cost McLaren the title ultimately. And let's move on to Ferrari, because actually, despite the fact Ferrari haven't really been, able to compete with McLaren and Mercedes really this weekend. Mercedes had a bit of an off day, but Ferrari, Charles Leclerc kept his nose clean. He finished second. Carlos Sainz, despite having to pit following a puncture, he finished sixth. Ferrari are now just 21 points behind McLaren going into Abu Dhabi. I mean, it's still a big margin. It's very much still McLaren's advantage and McLaren's title to lose. But actually, Ferrari can go into Abu Dhabi now with a bit more confidence, because actually a lot of people expect the Yas Marina circuit to be quite good for Ferrari.
And as Carlos Sainz was asked and responded in the pen, they've got nothing to lose. It's just a case of they've just got to do exactly what they can to upset McLaren as much as possible. I mean, both teams are just going to go into that preparing as they would ordinarily. Yes, okay, there's now a lot at stake for both teams. We know that McLaren hasn't won a constructors' title in 26 years. We know Ferrari hasn't won a constructors' title for 16 years. So there's a lot on the line for both these teams. As long as, and I'm going to pick McLaren in this instance because they're the ones that have the advantage, as long as they just go about their normal business, then it should be relatively straightforward. However, as we saw in the Qatar Grand Prix today, races often are not as straightforward as you would like them to be, because at one particular point, I think about the midway point of that Grand Prix, they were on course for about a 39-40 point lead. Yeah. And it was going into the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, and it was going to take then a catastrophic series of events for McLaren to then lose it in Abu Dhabi. Well, now it's only 21 points. So it means we do have a title decider and something to play for. So from Ferrari's perspective, yes, they've got to do a lot more to get over the line and beat McLaren. But as we've seen in Qatar, anything can happen on any given Sunday in any Grand Prix.
Anything can happen. And actually, one driver who had a pretty quiet Qatar Grand Prix in the end, at least a quiet Sunday, was George Russell. We'll talk about Mercedes now. George Russell started on pole. He finished fourth. But let's discuss more Lewis Hamilton, because, I mean, a race to forget, a season with the exception of 2 races to forget. Lewis finished outside the points. He got a 5-second time penalty for jumping the start. He then got a drive-through for speeding in the pit lane. And actually, in the end, he quite simply said to them over the Mercedes team radio to race engineer Peter Bonington, he just asked if he can retire the car, basically, resulting in a bit of a frosty confrontation of kind of Mercedes saying, no, you continue, unless you want to take this 5-second penalty into Abu Dhabi. It's surely the ending that, despite all their history and all their success, this has got to be now the worst ending that Lewis and Mercedes could have possibly imagined.
Yeah, when you think of the position that we were in going into the summer break, when Lewis had just won 2 Grand Prix, and we discussed it at the time that we all thought, this is it. Mercedes is really coming back into the fore. And we've touched on this as well in numerous podcasts and updates that it's just never happened. And it is petering out into, as you rightly saying it, something that neither Mercedes nor Lewis Hamilton would have wanted or wished for coming into this year. Yes, Lewis has got those 2 wins to look back on, and they are his only 2 wins in these past 3 years, which have not been great for him at all, as we know, under the current regulation set. He just wants to leave now. He's done. He just wants to get that Abu Dhabi Grand Prix out of the way. I actually asked him in the driver's pen specifically, I said, what are your hopes and expectations going into the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix? Surely you want to finish on some kind of high. And he just turned around and looked at me and said, I don't see it that way. I'm going into it with low expectations. And just that answer, it's just like, says everything you need to know about where Lewis is at right now in mind, body, and spirit with regard to his time at Mercedes. Yes, he's had a wonderful career at Mercedes. 6 world titles he's won with the team, but for these last 3 years to have just petered out in the way they are doing right now, it's just a very, very sad end for him. He's got a new chapter of his career now to write, and it is going to be a fascinating one to witness. What kind of Lewis Hamilton are we going to see at Ferrari next season? We've still got this current regulation set for 1 more year before everything changes again in 2026. What kind of car will Ferrari be able to give Lewis? Will it be something there where he can be more aggressive? As Toto Wolff pointed out in the Mercedes post-qualifying press release, Lewis loves a car, particularly in qualifying, where he can be really aggressive into the turns. He's not been able to get that. He's been very uncomfortable throughout all 3 years with all 3 cars that Mercedes has given him. He's not been able to push. He's not been able to go in, as I say, hard and aggressive as the way he'd like to. And that's led to, this real distance between himself and George Russell in qualifying. He's been trounced this year over 1 lap by George. No, in all seriousness, he's been thrashed. And it's 2 consecutive years now that George has beaten Lewis in the qualifying picture. So as I say, what is he going to get at Ferrari? What kind of car are they going to give him? Is it going to be the aggressive one that he really likes? Are we going to see the Lewis of old? 2021, pre-2021 Lewis when he was winning all those titles, 2021 when he was going up against Max and we had some fantastic racing between the two? Or is it going to be 1 more year of the sad Lewis, the struggling Lewis that we've seen over these past 3 years? Yeah.
And of course, on the topic of drivers being trounced by their teammate, Sergio Perez, I mean, his race kind of summed up another weekend from hell. He was one of several retirees, had a really bizarre spin, though. I mean, a weekend to forget for Checo, but how do you sum up the spin that happened? I mean, odd,
I can't.
bizarre.
I mean, Checo was one of the drivers that I didn't listen to in the pen. So I'd not looked back at or heard his comments, but it was just, as you say, yes, we've used that word a lot this weekend, Nick, but this one was just utterly bizarre, just to rub salt into the wounds of what transpired at the start of the sprint race, what transpired during qualifying. And I mean, Christian Horner's turned around and basically said that Checo knows what the consequences are. And you think,
Yeah,
whoa, here we go. This
big
sounds like
statement.
there's a big statement coming soon. Now, I know, or I'm led to believe anyway, from what I've been told over the course of this weekend, that talks are due with Christian, Helmut, and Checo on Monday. So will there be anything come out of that? Uh, you would assume that Red Bull will at least put Checo in the car for one last time in Abu Dhabi, unlike one of our next talking points coming up.
Well, the next talking point.
A lovely segue here I'm trying to come up with, Nick. And that's by the fact that, of course, Alpine
Yes.
will not have, for what we're 99% certain at this particular stage in the early hours of Monday. It's just gone, it's midnight as I look at my
Good job.
clock on the phone. Yeah, midnight here. Is the fact that Esteban Ocon will not be driving for Alpine in Abu Dhabi, and it will, in fact, be Jack Doohan. It was a very strange set of circumstances, the way this has all come out, Nick. Obviously, Esteban was the first into the driver's pen because he'd had that first lap crash. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
Nico Hulkenberg getting a bit squirrely with his hash going into turn one. And we had that bit of a concertina domino effect where he bumped into Ocon then bumped into Franco Colapinto, and that wiped out both Franco and Esteban. So as I say, Esteban, after a bit of a delay, was the first into the driver's pen. And he came out with some very unusual comments. He gave his thanks to the team for the year that he's had. And he said now it was time to look towards the future. And that was his closing comment to my question at the very end that I asked him about, what about looking ahead towards Abu Dhabi? And he didn't look towards Abu Dhabi. He said he was looking towards his future. Well, immediately, naturally, I got on the phone straight away to one of the Alpine communications people and I said, your driver's just come out with this. Does this lend itself to the fact that he's actually driven his last race? And I just got back the straightforward comment, we're not commenting on this at the moment. You knew then, without affirmation or a denial, that this was it. So we were able to go with the story. Ocon done effectively with Alpine. It's going to be Jack Doohan in the car. Talk's still going on between Toto Wolff because, of course, bottom line is that Esteban Ocon is still a Mercedes under contract reserve driver in many respects, and Flavio Briatore at Alpine. But it's literally a case of just ticking a few boxes,
Yeah.
and we're going to see the change confirmed on either Monday or Tuesday of this week.
And of course, it has been a massive day for Alpine, not just obviously for the Ocon expected news, but also Pierre Gasly, P5. I mean, we speak about the battle for sixth, and it's almost as more exciting than the battle between McLaren and Ferrari. I mean, the swings and turns going on. Haas went ahead or built a bigger buffer to Alpine on Saturday in the sprint. Alpine have turned it around and reclaimed sixth. They've gone 5 points clear of Haas, who also scored points in the race with Kevin Magnussen in P9. RB now are pretty much bearing an absolute miracle out of the fight for sixth. They're now 13 points behind Alpine, but I mean, 5 points alone is a pretty big margin for Haas now to make up in Abu Dhabi, because that itself is going to require a pretty, remarkable performance by Haas in the season finale. I mean, Pierre Gasly again, what a performance.
Fantastic. Fifth place. I mean, this guy has just absolutely turned a corner with that car over the past couple of months. I was speaking to Ollie Oakes, the Alpine team principal, after the Grand Prix, and I asked him specifically, I said, Ollie, when you joined the team just a few months ago, if somebody had said to you, given your position at the time, they were ninth place in the championship, they were looking nowhere. I say, somebody had said to you that going into the last race of the season, you would be in the current position you are now with a decent sandwich of points over Haas, as you've mentioned, Nick. What would you have thought? You would have thought incredulous. And pretty much he agreed. Obviously he's not going to take any specific credit for him being this miracle worker and having transformed the team, because he was aware when he did join of the steps that were being taken at the time to make this car more competitive. Now, it's been more competitive for Pierre Gasly, and it's just been a sad decline, a little bit like Lewis Hamilton with Mercedes, the
Yeah.
sad decline of Esteban Ocon, just unable to get any performance out of that car. Over the course of the sprint race, we was and the only difference between the two cars was a different front wing on Pierre Gasly's, 9/10 of a second on average slower Esteban Ocon compared to Pierre Gasly. Now, front wing is not going to make that
Yeah.
massive difference in performance between two drivers. It has been suggested to me that a little bit was going on inside Esteban Ocon's head as well. And this is a driver that, yes, while he's wanted to do his best for the team to help them get that constructor's position in the championship, and look at his performance in Brazil, of course, cannot not escape that. He has, to all intents and purposes, checked out. I use that phrase with regard to Lewis,
Yeah.
of course, post-qualifying on Saturday. And yes, this is why, for the interests of both team and driver, it's now looking, as I say, almost 100% certain that Esteban Ocon has gone, or he's going and will not be in the Alpine in Abu Dhabi, and instead it's going to be Jaguar.
I think this is the longest F1 update we've done all season, but that's because there are so many things
32
to
minutes,
discuss.
I know, wow.
So very, very quickly to run through the top 10, because there's one final thing to discuss. Max Verstappen was victorious ahead of Charles Leclerc and Oscar Piastri. George Russell was fourth. Gasly finished fifth. Carlos Sainz sixth. Fernando Alonso in a brilliant seventh. I'll skip to ninth. Kevin Magnussen, and 10th, Lando Norris. And that's because in P8, scoring
Ta-da.
Stake Sauber's first points of the season, Zhou Guanyu. Let's end on a feel-good story, because you know what? Stake have been through a lot this season. Of course, Zhou is one of the drivers who will not be on the grid next year. P8 for him, Stake's first points. I mean, good job, Zhou.
They've deserved it for all the hard work over the course of this year, for all the doom and gloom that surrounded that team. Audi takeover aside, the fact what's going to happen with Mattia Binotto's coming, of course, and we've got Jonathan Wheatley becoming team principal at some stage next year, leaving Red Bull after so many years. It's been a real tale of woe for Stake, and it was looking like they were going to finish pointless this season. And all of a sudden, they've delivered this upgrade right at the back end, a little bit too late, you got to feel, but
just a little.
Just a little bit, but at least it has propelled them into that 8th position. And it was so near, yet so far for Valtteri Bottas, because at one stage it was Zhou P8, Valtteri P10. Looked like he was going to get off the mark as well with a single point. But of course, unfortunately for Valtteri, there was a hard-charging Lando Norris coming behind that was desperate to try and get as many points as he possibly could for McLaren in the battle for that Constructors' Championship. And he did manage to take P10 off Valtteri very late in the race. Hard lines for Valtteri. He's got one more chance. He's never had a season without scoring a point. It's very sad for him the way his time in F1 is going to end. Who knows? He might be back on the grid in 2026. There's 2 seats going spare at a certain future American team. Can't rule it out. Definitely can't rule it out. But
the only positive for Valtteri, strange things have happened, and I guess the only positive for Valtteri is by finishing 11th. It means he has moved ahead of Logan Sargent in the driver's standings. So at least there is something. Ian, amazing stuff as always. For those who've been watching this video, let us know your thoughts on what was... I don't know how you sum it up. We've tried to sum it up. It's taken 35 minutes, but thank you for bearing with us. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Be sure to smash that like button, subscribe to the Racing News 365.com channel, and tune in to our podcast on Monday, because I have a feeling it's going to be a very, very good one. Ian, safe travels to Abu Dhabi. We'll see you in the podcast on Monday. See you later, all.
And keep those comments respectable, folks. As always, take care. Thank you very much for watching and listening.
Bye, guys.